Hello. Today I would like to talk about the move to global war in Europe from 1933 until 1939. I'll go through maybe a dozen different events that feel important in terms of this time. But the purpose of this video isn't to give you enough knowledge to think critically about the period. Essentially, each event deserves its own expansion on anything that I'll say today. But I hope that I'll provide a schema or a framework that you can use to tie all of the events together. I also think, though, before we start off with the Geneva Disarmament Conference in October of 1933, that there are maybe some general ideas of pre-existing factors that we should consider. We have to consider that we're starting with a landscape that includes the Great Depression, high levels of unemployment in most countries, and certainly the worst depression in 2 or 3 generations. Ultimately, the Great Depression is the greatest economic recession of the 20th century. So it also had this novel feeling to it, which probably felt like it was challenging the very basis of the economic system of capitalism. We also have the Treaty of Versailles and the other Paris peace settlements, but specifically the Treaty of Versailles pertaining to Germany, although Italy would be interested in revising some of the other Paris peace settlements as well. But the Treaty of Versailles includes, on the one hand, the League of Nations, which has been really challenged by 1933, but certainly still exists and meets and has potential. But the Manchurian crisis of 1931, the Leighton Report, and the failure of the League to really defend China from the attack has weakened the League, which is part of the Treaty of Versailles. But also the Treaty of Versailles contains some clauses that probably need revision over time. At a certain point, Germany is going to want to reoccupy the Rhineland. At a certain point, Austria wanted to join with Germany and could want to do so again. And at a certain point, the German army is going to expand beyond 100,000 men. We also have a radical right-wing ideology, which usually we would refer to as sort of lowercase f fascism, saving the uppercase F fascism for Italian fascism. But we have this rise after the First World War of a sort of revolutionary conservative movement. So revolutionary that it's not trying to conserve anything, but to actually go backwards, oftentimes towards a mythical past. And on the other side of the spectrum, we also have the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union acts and continues to act as a bit of a boogeyman. You saw what the Bolsheviks did in Russia. They could do the same here. So the fear of communism is very real in capitalist countries in the 1930s. We've spoken about how German colonial claims could hope to expand or to revise the Treaty of Versailles, or at least how German claims on land, either in Europe or beyond, could challenge the Treaty of Versailles. We see how their perhaps desire to connect with Austria, and we see how the question of the Rhineland are all problems. But the first problem that really comes up is the question of what to do about armament. And this is particularly salient at the time period of the Great Depression because everyone would like to reduce their overall levels of armaments. This would be beneficial for everyone. But at the Disarmament Conference, which is taking place in Geneva, we see here, this is Germany's first chance to sort of challenge the existing order of things under Hitler. And in fact, Hitler does exactly what we expect. Makes a seemingly reasonable offer. Ultimately, it's unacceptable, of course, to the French that they would have parity. The whole point has been to not have parity in terms of number of troops. And so Hitler uses this as an opportunity to withdraw from the League of Nations. And this withdrawal from the League of Nations prioritizes the idea of bilateral treaties and bilateral negotiations with Hitler. Now, we've talked about this lowercase f fascist movement, and one thing is there's no particular reason why different fascist movements should be aligned. They, in fact, because they're so ultranationalist, we would expect they might even be in conflict with each other. However, an ideology like Nazism isn't really exportable. I mean, there will be a Nazi movement actually in the United States. There'll be essentially a fascist movement in Britain as well. But none of them are widely successful because you can't just copy somebody else's nationalism, except if you're Austrian. The National Socialist Party of Germany and the National Socialist Party of Austria actually should be able to link together because they both have this ethno-Germanic sense to them. And so there is a Nazi party in Austria, which is quite strong, and although not as popular even as the Nazi Party was in Germany in 1930, does exist and does successfully assassinate the Chancellor of Austria, Engelbert Dollfuss, in July of 1934. This, then, we can see is, okay, we've taken some steps towards rearming, we're taking some steps towards linking with Austria. Hitler definitely knew about this ahead of time, but Italy intervenes. And so this Italian intervention at the assassination of Dollfuss is a really important moment for showing us that the alignment between Hitler and Mussolini, which ultimately will come about in 1936, is not at all inevitable. In fact, it makes more sense for two countries in the middle of Europe, both interested perhaps in expanding to the east, both with big, charismatic leaders who embrace violence to solve their problems. It would actually make tons of sense if these guys came into conflict with each other. They might arguably be the two most warlike countries in Europe at this point. We expect that they might come into conflict with each other. And in fact, it seems that the assassination of Dollfuss almost brings them into conflict. Italy threatens it brings its troops up to the Brenner Pass to be ready to enter Austria. And of course, Hitler has to back down, and the Nazis don't take over Austria. They're not strong enough to take it over from within Austria, and they don't get the German support to take it over from without. Hitler then, of course, announces rearmament, and so now we did disarmament, we've done Austria. Oop, that didn't work. Well, let's get the army big up. And so in response then to the German announcement of rearmament, we have the Stresa Agreement, where Britain, France, and Italy come together in order to safeguard and secure the rest of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, we lost the size of the German army. Okay, but the rest of it, the three of us will go through and we will guarantee. And as you may have noticed, this is a challenge to the League of Nations, not intentionally maybe, but certainly the League should be able to do this. These three countries sort of going around the back of the League. And then the real undermining of this happens with the British when they are willing to make the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, limiting the size of the German Navy to a ratio of the British Navy, saving the British money in terms of how big they need to make their fleet. But not only does it seem to go against the Treaty of Versailles and against the League of Nations, but also it goes past the Stresa Agreement, because the whole point of the Stresa Agreement was to bring the Germans into a controlled situation because Italy, Britain, and France were all going to combine to enforce the Treaty of Versailles. And so almost instantly then we have that agreement nullified. And that seems like a big mistake on the part of the British. Meanwhile, we have questions of domestic politics in Italy, perhaps spurring Italian expansion in Africa. And we've seen some of that in 1934, and of course that breaks open in the fall of 1935 with the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. it would be interesting to do a detailed view to see exactly what sort of reaction Mussolini anticipated. But the anticipated reaction is confused because the Hoare-Laval Pact, that gives us a pretty good sense of what the British and French were doing behind closed doors, and it bursts out into the open. But now we also can see from the Hoare-Laval Pact how complicated the situation really is, because the British and the French, on the one hand, have a public that refuses to allow them to simply acquiesce in Italian expansion. And at the same time, they have a public who doesn't express any willingness to go to war over Abyssinia. And so then the question is exactly what would the public have allowed the British and French to do? Well, we could argue that closing the Suez Canal, stronger sanctions, these sorts of things would have really limited the Italian ability to make war in Abyssinia. But even though they've sort of betrayed the Stresa Front, the framework of the Stresa Front, Britain and France will use Italy to come together to restrain Germany. That's still intact. So it seems that the British and the French, they try to please everyone and they end up pleasing no one. They are annoying enough to Mussolini that he withdraws from this sort of Stresa trio, but they don't do enough to restrain him to actually save Abyssinia. It's often said that Hitler remilitarizes the Rhineland in March of 1936 because people are distracted by Abyssinia. And maybe that is true. But I think it's more correct to say that Italy is distracted by Abyssinia. Truly, the remilitarization of the Rhineland is what the Stresa Agreement was designed to prevent, and that Italy has broken with Britain and France over Abyssinia seems to give Hitler the opening that he's interested in. And of course, his generals aren't in favor of it, but it didn't come as a total surprise to the French. They definitely had intelligence that Germany was going to use their recent agreement with the Soviet Union as an excuse to remilitarize the Rhineland. The Spanish Civil War then breaks out, also not at a particularly coordinated time. It has to do with the elections in Spain, not with reactions to things outside, but it happens at a very good time for Hitler and the Nazis, because it immediately allows them to engage on the same side of a war with Mussolini and the fascists. And both the fascists and the Nazis are very involved with getting the rebel soldiers from North Africa over into Spain. And, of course, the Spanish Civil War really is the most obvious catalyst, although probably it's German support for Abyssinia that's more important, in the alignment of what Mussolini would call the Rome-Berlin axis, and the limited agreements that are signed in October of 1936, but that do usher that these two warlike states who want to change the status quo are going to work together to do that. And then the Anti-Comintern Pact of November of 1936 also then acts as, on the other side of the world, much more clear alignment. It makes sense that Japan and Germany might seek to be allies. The largest threat to German expansion to the east is obviously the Soviet Union. The largest threat to Japanese expansion into Manchuria is the Soviet Union. Even if there's no ideological connection, there's a geographic reason. So they can be allies by means of geography, not because they're close to each other, but because they have a threat in between them. So the Anti-Comintern Pact, even if there was no anti-communist sentiment in Japan or in Germany, that makes a lot of sense as well. However, commentators both at the time and since have pointed out that in fact it also has quite a lot to do with an anti-British sense by both. And we really see Germany moving away from any chance at aligning itself with Britain by 1936. From the Hossbach Memorandum, a year later, we know that Hitler isn't anticipating any war with Britain. That's not any of the cases that he goes forward. And of course, the Hossbach Memorandum is very useful for showing that there was planned aggression, and not that useful for showing how Hitler's plans were carried through, because none of case 1, 2, or 3 are particularly followed. I mean, Hitler doesn't wait until 43 to begin the war. There is no domestic instability so great in France that he takes advantage of it. And Britain and France do not get into conflict with Italy over the Balearic Islands. But I think there are 3 big things that we get coming out of the armament crisis, which led to the Hossbach Memorandum. There's a need for Austria and Czechoslovakia, and those are going to be Hitler's immediate focuses. There's time pressure. We have to go ahead and Hitler speaking to the people in the room, have to act by 1943, time pressure, and we need to take opportunities to expand sooner if they are available. And all 3 of these things we will see, in fact, carried through. But let's also remember the reason for the Hossbach Memorandum is a growing economic crisis in Germany, where the rapid remilitarization is sucking up resources and starting to drive up prices, and the economy is running too hot, we would say, and is possibly going to start facing some inflation. So we can see, and we should always keep in mind, the way in which economics is also going to drive the way that these dictatorships and non-dictatorships are acting. But it seems especially important in Italy and in Germany because they really seem to be driving the decisions and forcing other people to react to them. Hitler, of course, is also consolidating his power at this point. And the final real moment of his consolidation of power happens with his removal of the generals and placing himself in charge of all branches of the military in February of 1938. This follows the scandal of the Fritsch affair, which really is better to deal with when we talk about the domestic politics of Germany. But by Hitler removing his generals, we have the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden saying Germany has become more menacing, more aggressive, but less formidable. They're actually less scary at this point. They're less capable of waging war. And so, with Germany now having secretly announced it's interested in Austria and Czechoslovakia, but also murmuring over and over on the world stage, again, about revising things, I think the British are kind of thinking perhaps there are some colonies that we can hand over in Africa that would be, maybe that would satiate Hitler. But Hitler, just like Bismarck before him, his map of Africa is in Europe, and his big focus is going to be on Austria. And so we don't need to walk through the Anschluss timeline here, but it is important to see the context in which this happens. Hitler's removed the generals who could have opposed such aggressive action. Goering, who's in charge of the economy and in charge of the 4-year plan, which is also links the economy with the military, is very in favor of a rapid aggressive expansion. And we have the growing acquiescence of the British and the French, which he's seen in 1935 and 1936. So even though he was waiting for an opportunity, I think he sensed that Austria was not just his right, but low-hanging fruit. And it seemed difficult. If the French weren't going to intervene to prevent the remilitarization of the Rhineland right next to them, would they really seek a war just to keep German-speaking people from uniting with German-speaking people? Perhaps they should have, but it seems that Hitler calculated that they wouldn't. So the bullying of Schuschnigg and then ultimately the rejection of the idea of the plebiscite and the quick march in, this definitely has the sense of not being a carefully thought out plan, but Hitler responding to the opportunity of the moment. But it's important to note that this time Italy doesn't oppose. This is not at all like 1934. So let's see how far we've come in just this period of time between the assassination of Dollfuss in July of 1934 and the Anschluss in March of 1938. And that's a really good comparison to be able to make. Following on Austria, Hitler carries through with his general idea of the Hossbach meeting, and the Munich crisis begins in September. This is certainly something that it's worth digging in much deeper to than this video will do. But it's important for us to note that it really does come after the Chamberlain's first two visits. It really does come pretty close to war. The British Navy mobilizes on September 25th. So does the French army. It really does seem as though this is going to lead to war. And if World War II was inevitable by 1938, there's decent arguments that it would have been shorter and more confined if, in fact, the British and French and Czechoslovaks had fought in 38. But the benefit of hindsight, or the clouding of how terrible the Second World War was, makes it difficult for us to really unpack how to suggest a war in 1938, because Britain and France were far less armed than they would be even a year later. And then Mussolini intervenes, right? And so we have almost these echoes of the Stresa Agreement. And that must have been the way it must have felt to some British and French statesmen. See, we knew Mussolini could save the day. And then the Munich settlement, which of course sells out the Sudeten land completely to the Germans, goes exactly against the French treaty with the Czechoslovaks and doesn't even invite the Czechoslovaks to the meeting. Well, this is... Well, we can have our emotions about it today, but it's celebrated at the time. The French Prime Minister thinks that when he gets off the train, he sees the crowds and he thinks that they're there to scream at him, maybe to cause violence to him, and they're there to cheer him. So the public sentiment is impossible to ignore when we talk about the Munich settlement, and of course, Chamberlain himself promising peace in our time is obviously responding to public pressure. All of this, of course, is blown out of the water by the full invasion, which takes place in March of 1939. Now the Germans control all of Czechoslovakia. Once you've taken over the Sudetenland, that's the only defensible portion because of the geography. So this obviously leads to the Anglo-French guarantee of Poland. This is the final break with an idea of Stresa keeping us safe. But Czechoslovakia was much better able to defend itself than Poland. And the Soviet Union had a willingness to support Czechoslovakia that it doesn't have for Poland. There's no reasonable sense in which the Soviet Union would want to expand into Czechoslovakia in 1938. But parts of Poland definitely would have been interesting because that would be recovering things that were lost in the First World War. So even though it comes as a huge surprise, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which happens in August of 1939, shouldn't be such a great surprise because just from the pure calculus, if you can get rid of the idea that it's crazy that the Nazis and the communists are allying together, just looking at a map, these are two countries who are anti-Polish. And so it does make sense as a response to the Anglo-French guarantee of Poland. Everyone's looking to Poland, and the Soviets aren't going to be left out of this either. Now, in this case, we've skipped over two major events. We've skipped over the Italian invasion of Albania, demonstrating that Italy is going to get its prizes too. Things are being revised through force. That's important. So now it's not just Italy. It's not just Germany and Czechoslovakia. It's also Italy and Albania. We're gobbling up the old Habsburg Empire. And this is sort of ratified by the Pact of Steel, where really now the Italians do promise to support the Germans should there be a war. The Stresa Front is completely broken, and Germany has now even more than a free hand. And because of the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact, Hitler knows exactly what he needs to do in Poland. And then, of course, Germany will invade Poland in September of 1939. So when we look at this framework, this flow, I think then, looking at it in the 1930s, it might not be completely true, but thinking about the 1930s as being Germany and Italy's attempts to revise the Paris peace settlements is at least an interesting framework to understand this. Now, not everything fits into this. Of course, things like the Spanish Civil War don't fit neatly into that definition. But much of the activity that goes on in the 1930s seems directed about policy goals that would have been very, very understandable even 20 years earlier. Not that we would say that the German Empire has huge designs on Czechoslovakia in the First World War, but it is still worth remembering that this idea of a Mitteleuropa, this is an old idea. So it's wrong to say that the 1930s are just a rehash of pre-existing foreign policy goals from 1917, 1918, 1920. But thinking about the ways it is and isn't that can provide a really good framework for you to understand the continuity, but also the change that we're seeing in this time. So I hope that provides a good schema for linking these together so that you can understand the story of the 30s, and now we can go back and really add in the detailed understanding of the important events in order to evaluate how accurate or perhaps overly simplified my schema has been.